how's it going? My name is Mir, and I'm a photographer from Texas, and welcome back to Photo Mode Perspective, where we look at photo modes in different video games, but through the eyes of a photographer. If this is a topic that interests you, please consider subscribing. With that said, in this video we're going to be looking at Demon Souls. Let's get started, shall we? So to access the photo mode, it's pretty simple. It's just like God of War. It is the left side of the touchpad. And there we go. Let's get through these settings. There is quite a bit in here. So this first tab is for the player, so different actions you can do with your character. You have your camera, depth of field, vignette, filters, picture, color, more on this later, and bloom. Let's start with the player. The first few player settings are simple enough. I mean, you can turn on and off the your character, whatever, like helmet. So here my character has like a headband on, so you can turn that on and off. But if you have a helmet on, you can turn that off. Weapons, do you want to show both weapons, one weapon, no weapons? You can do that. Different poses, which you can get creative with. You can have a lot of fun with these. So those first few are fairly simple, straightforward. Then we're gonna get into like the more advanced player features. So we'll start with this one, the expression. So character looks so scared. So there's some cool expressions in here you can use for whatever situation. If you want to be like, a funny face, if you want to be like angry, whatever. Like, okay, cool, you have that. So let's say you give them the happy expression, right? Well, there's an intensity for how expressive you want them to be. So here it's just maxed out at a value of 1. So if I bring this down, you can change exactly like how happy they are. So for me, like how I'm feeling right now is probably about a 9, a 0.09. That's me right now. So that's pretty cool. You can get expressive and you can fine tune how expressive they are. Then it gets interesting very quickly, just on this first tab, the look at feature. So when it's set to auto, it's basically wherever your character is looking whenever you turn the photo mode on. So if I were to close this and just kind of go back to the photo mode, look at auto, right? Now if we change it forward, simple enough, the character is looking forward, then it's at camera. So if you really want to get creative, now like if I just pan around the character, his head is moving with the camera. So let's say you're fighting some giant demon, right? I would show you, but I'm trash at this game. So let's say we change the expression to happy. He's very happy he's here. And then if we just kind of, pan this around, oh, this is gonna give me nightmares. I don't like this. But yeah, that's pretty cool that you can get them to look at the camera. So wherever you move so the camera, if you pan in front of it, it'll just follow you. Okay, and then after this is with camera. So let's say if we just kind of whip around behind the character, and we just kind of move the camera, to the left and to the right. Do you see the character's head moving? So you can just basically say like, I want the character to look over here, and they'll do it. I want them to look down, and they'll do it. So you can basically just become a director at this point. It's like, hey, can you move your head to the left a little bit? Just look at the guy that's glowing in blue. Yeah, sure thing, boss. Pretty neat. And then you have a manual control. So with the manual controls, you can just pinpoint exactly where you want the character to look at. So whether it be like left or right, or like up or down, you can really just kind of go crazy with their expression, and then also where they're looking at. All right, so on to the next tab. This is your camera tab. So here, the FOV zoom, it's your field of view. It's not in millimeters, it's actually in degrees. So how this works is that the larger the number is, the wider it's going to get. And if it was in millimeters, it would be the opposite. The smaller the number, the wider it gets. So at 55 degrees, this is the widest it can go. And if I move back and go the opposite direction, this is more of your telephoto at 25 degrees. And what I do like is that this game, just like the other games I've looked at, introduces your wide angle distortion and your telephoto compression. So what that means is, so right here, FOV zoom at 25 degrees, your telephoto. If I just pose the character here, and then just kind of look up here, that statue looks a lot larger than it actually is, and it looks like it's right in front of the character. And then if I were to go over to like the wide angle side of things, frame the character in the same spot, the statue is much further away. This is your wide angle distortion, and this is your telephoto compression. There's something else I want to mention, because I think I've mentioned it in only one other video. Let's go wide for this shot. And there's a reason why I picked this spot in particular. So let's say you move back right here, right? So with the widest it can go, I can capture, the character, I can capture the scene in the background. Now if I hide this UI, so do you see the little areas next to the stairs? They're just basically forming a V shape going into the character. These lines are known as leading lines. And what they basically do is just guide your eyes along this rail to the subject. So one of the easiest examples, and one of the things you may be able to practice at home, like with your phone or like a camera, would be using a wide angle lens in a hallway of some sort. So what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to flash a picture I took when I was traveling in Prague of this escalator. And this escalator is a very long escalator. At the very base of it, what I did was I took a picture with a wide angle lens, and it made the escalator look extremely long. Now, granted, it was a long escalator, but because of the wide angle lens, it just made it look like it was just going into nothing. Wide angle lenses in some sort of hallway or any sort of lines, just kind of pay attention to that and use those lines as a way to guide someone's eye to the subject. Like, where do you want them pointing? In this case, it's pointing at my character. So next up is the roll. So this one, it changes the rotation of the image. And then film grain, again, personal preference. It's up to you if you want like a really grainy image or not. I prefer more of a cleaner image, so I'm just gonna leave it off. Now going back to the roll, in my God of War video, I mentioned the roll that I didn't really want to use it in that game, but I think for Demon Souls, roll is going to come in handy. So if I go all the way down to -90 degrees, it looks weird on screen, but I think with this game, a portrait orientation would look a lot better. So it's basically a taller image as opposed to a landscape image, which is more of like a wide image. So because of the sense of scale in this game, because of the demons and the environment, they tend to be a lot taller than other games. I would say a portrait orientation would really show off that sense of scale. All right, so the next tab is going to be the depth of field tab. This one's pretty interesting because it has multiple different modes. So you have the game focus, and it doesn't let you control anything, but it's basically just the depth of field that you would see in the game. So if you just turn on the photo mode while you're playing the game and you're like, man, this looks cool as it is, then you can just save it like that. So the first mode is going to be player, and essentially what this is doing is that it's just focusing on your character and blurring everything else. And then of course you have your different parameters you can change for this depth of field. We'll come back to these in just a second. The next one is target. So if you were playing the game and you targeted an enemy, it would focus more on the enemy than it would your own character. And then the final mode is depth. This one, you have the complete control over your depth of field. So your focus depth, so essentially, like, where do you want the blur to go? Do you want it to focus on your character, or do you want it focus on the background? So in this case, what I want to do, let me just focus on the character. Leave the background blurred out. Focus range. So basically, it's splitting the focus. So there's like a line in front of your character. Like, okay, this is where I'm stopping the focus. It's going to be blurred out after that. Then the higher you go with the focus range, it starts moving backwards. So now it's like all the way to the back, saying like, okay, all of this is in focus. So depending on your preference, where you want to go, you can change how much blur, like where the blur stops. So focus range basically sets how far do you want your image to be in focus And then from there, how far do you want it to be blurry? Blur range is basically how blurry do you want the image to be. So if I turn this up, it's actually turning down the blurriness. So I can fine tune basically how much, bokeh I want. And if you're trying to replicate this in a camera, it would be changing your f-stop. So the smaller the f-stop number, the blurrier the background is going to get. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to make this as blurry as possible, because I'm going to show off the next thing, the near intensity and the far intensity. So these two settings are more for the photo mode of this game than it is something you can replicate in real life. So I'll tell you what that means. Basically, you can control the blurriness of the foreground. So if you look at the very bottom of this image, you see how those steps are blurred out? And then the background, you can control that. And these two, the near intensity and far intensity, control each side. How much of that blur do you want in the background and in the foreground? So if I were to change the near intensity, take a look at the steps at the bottom. So if I bring this down, it becomes more clear. And then the far intensity, so if we look at the background, bring that down, it becomes more clear. So now you can really fine tune how much blur you want in the image, how much bokeh you want. And this is something that's a little bit more, creative freedom on a video game. Just kind of keep this in mind. So at the end of the day, you're still playing a video game, so there are some creative liberties taken to give you a certain look. So this, you may not be able to replicate in the real world, but that's okay. You can still have fun with it and understand, like, blur in the foreground and then blur in the background. And don't forget, it's always good to have just fun with these kind of things. Like, some people tend to forget and take it way too seriously. It's like, enjoy it, have fun with it. Moving on to the next tab, you have your vignette. The vignette just darkens up the corners and the sides of the image. So it's like this oval that just surrounds your screen. And what I'm going to do is just turn it up all the way, just to show you the next thing, the sharpness of this vignette. So the sharpness is basically how much of the vignette do you want to blend into the image. So if I turn this sharpness all the way up, notice how it's, blending in less and less. And if I go all the way, it's just one clear-cut oval. And it just doesn't look good. It doesn't blend into the image. But you can put these settings all the way in the maximum just to see what it's doing and then fine tune it from there. So size I maxed out, sharpness I maxed out, and the intensity would be your opacity. So how transparent do you want this to be? Simple enough, right? So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna change the size of this. I'm gonna bring it back. Let's keep doing this. Maybe something like that. Bring the sharpness down just so it blends into the image a little bit more. And I don't want to go too hard with the vignette. It's already kind of a dark image as it is, and if I go too much with the vignette, it just doesn't look good. So like I said in my God of War video, use vignettes sparingly and just kind of use them as a way to guide someone's eye to the subject. Alright, so the next tab is the filter tab. So in here, it's self-explanatory. There are filters or presets if you want to look at it that way as well. And these, you can just give your photo a unique look. And then once you get kind of towards the end of this filter list, there are some saved ones in here too. So there's actually 4 saved filter slots, and you can fine tune the image. Well, we're going to get to the color editing in just a minute, but you can fine tune the image to your liking and then save the filter. So since there's 4 slots, you can say like, okay, save filter number 1. I'm going to use this for dark environments. Save filter number 2. I'm going to use this for open environments, things like that. So you can have some fun with the color editing and so on, and then save a look that you're really happy with. And the best part about it, if you're really happy with it and you're like, you know what, I want to play the game like this, you can go down to persist in game and use in game. So it'll just look like that all the time while you're playing. And then of course you have your filter intensity. So basically just how much of the filter do you want to bring in. So I think this is one I saved. This is one I just kind of messed with. And I think I'm going to do it something like this. Maybe something like that. So use in game. So let's just exit out of the photo mode. So now the game has this very unique look. This is a look that I edited. It's a look that I just kind of went for. So yeah, these saved filters are actually pretty cool. Just let your creative mind go and see what you can come up with. Now, if you're curious what I did with this filter specifically, you can pause it here if you want, but this is the picture setting for this filter. And then for the color, all I did was the highlights, I took out the green. That was it. So I'm actually going to reset this filter back to the normal setting. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna create a new filter. And while we're doing that, I'll explain to you these next 3 tabs, because they all kind of go hand in hand, but they're also pretty unique. So the first tab is your picture tab. So you have your brightness, contrast, exposure, and saturation. The next one, you have color, and here you can change the tint of the entire image. You can change just the shadows, just the midtones, or just the highlights. Pretty unique how you can do a lot of color editing in this game. So lastly would be the bloom, which would be your bright light source. So something like that coming through the ceiling. So you can fine tune that to your liking. So we're going to start with the picture tab. So the brightness just changes how light or dark the entire image is. So if I just crank this, it just gets super bright. But I would avoid using brightness first because it just looks a little washed out. It just doesn't look, to me, it doesn't look that good. So let me reset that. So instead of brightness, go to exposure instead. Exposure will essentially do the same thing. It'll brighten or darken your image, but it'll give a more pleasing effect. So if I bump this exposure, that looks much better than bumping up just the brightness. With the exposure, it doesn't look as washed out. And the way I look at exposure, if we bring up the exposure, it's basically the highlights telling the shadows like, hey, you know what, shadows, you take a break, I'm gonna take over. So now the highlights are taking over this image and just brightening up the whole scene. And if we go the opposite direction, it's the shadows telling the highlights like, you know what, go take a break, take a vacation, I'll take over. So now the shadows are taking over. So yeah, if you want to change the brightness of your image, go for the exposure first, and then the brightness you can use to kind of fine tune it if you want, but to get a more pleasing look, go with exposure. So I think with this, I'm going to bump up the exposure just a little bit, not too much. I don't want to go too hard with it. If you were to bump up your exposure even more, you'll get kind of a washed out image, right? So if I just kind of crank it, it just looks a little, it looks fine, but a little washed out. So what you can do in this situation would be to bump up the contrast a little bit. Just kind of tame the image. It doesn't look as washed out as before. So the image overall is brighter, but it doesn't have like a washed out effect. It doesn't look like it's dull or anything like that. So if you're gonna bump up the exposure, bump up the contrast as well. Not too much, because if you go too much with it, it's not gonna look good. Subtlety is key with editing images. Just bump it up slightly, and then you may get your desired effect. If not, then always go to the extreme and then work your way backwards. Either way, just cranking everything up to like the highest setting is just going to give you a really not so pleasing look. Just be subtle with it. And then lastly in this picture tab is your saturation. So this is mainly for your color. So if I were to bring this saturation down, it just kind of sucks a lot of the color out of the image. And of course, if I reset it and go the opposite direction, it'll just boost the colors. Now, some people really like this look. I don't like it. I prefer more of a subtle look. And it also depends on the image and situation. Sometimes you want to bump the saturation just a little bit, or sometimes you want to pull away the saturation because there's too much. So it's kind of a personal preference, but at the same time, learn how to be subtle with it. Because if you go too hard, it's just not going to look, pleasing. It's just going to look, ugh. And speaking of color, let's move on to that tab. And in the color balance, it's set to tint right now. So this will basically affect the entire image. So let me explain something real quick. Primary colors are normally red, yellow, blue, correct? Well, for digital screens, it's red, green, blue. So that's why all the color parameters you have here are red, green, blue. So you're taking a digital image, you're more than likely going to share this on a digital screen. And if you go into your monitor settings and try to calibrate the color, it'll be red, green, blue more than likely. The nice thing is that because these are primary colors, you can mix and match where you want them. So if I were to, bring up the blues, let's say we take away some of the greens, bring up the red a little bit, give it more of like a purple look to it. I mean, you could do that. It's really all down to personal preference. Now let's move away from tint. Let's talk about the next couple color balance options. You have your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. So shadows are the darkest parts of your images, highlights are the brightest parts, and your midtones are basically everything in between. So let's say for shadows, I want to take away the green, and we're gonna add some blue. So already this image is starting to look a little different. Not the entire image, but just the dark parts of the image. We're gonna go to highlights. Let's say, what do I want to do here? Let's say we bump up the reds. Give it more of a doom vibe. So again, it's not affecting the entire image, only the brightest parts of the image. And then your midtones, let's just bring up the greens. The cool thing about this game is that it has color editing, and you can fine-tune the color for shadows, midtones, and highlights. I would suggest just messing around with this because it's really unique for a photo mode. I don't think I've seen another photo mode do this where they split shadows, midtones, and highlights. This is something that you'd be doing in when you're editing photos in like Lightroom or something. So here you're only changing the colors, but still that's really cool that you can do that. And then this last tab is your bloom. So this will affect this massive ray of light that's coming in. So if I bring down the threshold, for example, it's going to make it brighter. So your threshold is basically controlling like how much of the bloom do you want. So the strength is basically your opacity for the bloom, like how much do you want in there. Let's just crank it up a little bit. And then you have your fall off, which let's actually move a little closer over here. Basically the fall off of this thing is just how much do you want this bloom to glow. Again, very subtle effect, but it's there. So if I just move it to the extremes, you can definitely tell that something is changing. And then you have the saturation of the color of the bloom. So if I bring this down, it'll just take the color out of the bloom. Again, very subtle effect, but you can fine tune it. And then lens debris, you'd be able to see it. If I bring this threshold down, you'll be able to see the lens debris a little bit better. Yeah, you can see all these specks on the screen. So if I bring up this lens debris, you can really see it. And it only shows up when there's light hitting the lens. It's a neat little effect, but personal preference. If you want to use it, you can. If not, that's okay. So we have successfully edited this photo to a unique look. What we're going to do is we're going to hit square and we're going to save it. So I'm going to save this to filter 2, and then you can name it to whatever. So I'll just name this, YouTube. So now I can just go through all these filters, go to the one we just made, persist in game, use in game, exit out of the photo mode, and there we go. Now it just feels like I'm playing Doom at this point. So let's just go into this archstone and just see what this filter looks like in a different area. Because it might look good in one area, but it might look awful in another one. So let's change this. Filter. Use in game, no. Okay, so this is what the original game looks like, and then that's what it looks like in with the filter. So yeah, that's pretty cool that you can do that. That you can just change the entire look of the game to, a personal preference, and then just play it this way. All right, let's try here. Let's see what this looks like in there. let's see what I can do with this. So you know how I was saying that you can use that roll to get like a portrait image? So I think we're gonna do that here. So photo mode, and we're gonna keep this filter on. You know, I think that looks pretty good. I like the way this looks. It does look weird on screen just having it sideways, but it'd be best just to share the image, download the image, and then just rotate it. And then you'll have more of like a portrait image, so like a taller image. So yeah, I think I'm gonna save this. The thing that I really loved about this was the color editing. The fact that you can just change the color of the shadows, midtones, and highlights is just insane. I haven't seen another game do this. If there is another game that does this, please let me know, because I would love to see it. I would love to check it out. But not only that, not only can you change it, you can also save it as a filter. You can save it and then just use it in the game. So I just exit the game, I can just run around with this look that I just created. So yeah, hopefully you learned something from this, and I'll see you guys next time.